loss was less the result of a full-scale English invasion than of a border skirmish that went tragically wrong. The disaster stemmed less from Henry VIII's aggression than from James V's decision to launch a counterattack on an epic scale without choosing the ground or the moment carefully enough. In reaction to the incursions of English forces led by the Duke of Norfolk, James sent an army to pillage the disputed territory to the north and east of Carlisle, known as the Debatable Land. His troops forded the River Esk at low tide. When they returned, it was high tide, and they were caught between the river and a bog. Forced to retreat by a smaller but better disciplined English battalion, the Scots were snared. Around 1,200 were taken prisoner, including 23 important nobles and lairds, who were dispatched as hostages to London, where they were put in the Tower. James V felt a deep psychological blow. He had been militarily and personally humiliated, his loss of face the greater in that he had been ensconced safely at a distance and was not leading his troops. Cowardice was not the issue. James was a brave warrior, but he misjudged the risks. The result was a disintegration of his forces. It was a more damaging loss to his reputation than that suffered 30 years before by his father, James IV, whose own army had been cut to pieces at Flodden Field by the father of this very same English commander. The political effects of both defeats, a long royal minority, were identical. James V rode to Linlithgow to see his wife begin her confinement, but almost instantly left for Edinburgh and then Falkland, where he took to his bed. It is unlikely that he loved his wife, since he took so many mistresses, but he cared greatly about his baby, and his sudden departure tells us more about his mental state than about his family ties. He went to pieces when told that his heir was not a boy. His 2 infant sons had died the previous year, and now his thoughts turned to Marjorie Bruce, King Robert I's daughter and the founder of the Stuart dynasty. He exclaimed, "The devil go with it. It will end as it began. It came from a woman, and it will end in a woman." James died at midnight on December the 14th. He was only 30, but had suffered recurrent illnesses. A life of sexual dissipation, leading to pox and endemic fevers, and a serious hunting accident had weakened his immune system. He died of natural causes, unlike his father, who had perished at Flodden in the murkiest of circumstances. Although seemingly killed by the English in the battle, it is just as likely that he was murdered in the closing stages of the fight by one of his rebellious lords. His son had succeeded him at the age of 17 months. Now history had repeated itself. His granddaughter, Mary Stuart, was queen at the age of 6 days. Henry VIII was determined to outwit and outmaneuver France. According to his version of law and history, Scotland, despite being an independent state and a sovereign realm, would become a satellite of England, a jewel within the orb of Henry's imperial crown. It was the beginning of the Tudor claim to an Anglo-British empire that, while Mary was still a child, was to provoke a French counterclaim to a Franco-British one. A marriage between the infant Mary and Henry's own young son would smooth the way. As long as Henry VIII tried to subordinate Scotland to England and detach the country permanently from French influence, Mary of Guise meant to oppose him and to protect French and Guise interests there. She decided to move Mary from Linlithgow, a pleasure palace that could not withstand a siege, to the security of her own castle of Stirling, an almost impregnable fortress at the top of a steep rock. The child and her mother made their journey on July the 27th, 1543. Although barely out of swaddling clothes, the young Mary travelled with all the pomp and circumstance she would one day take as her due. Stirling Castle would be home to Mary and her mother for the next 4 years. It was an appropriate setting, as its magnificent Great Hall and royal apartments had been lavishly reconstructed as part of a massive royal rebuilding programme. The Great Hall alone could seat 300 people for dinner. On September the 9th, 6 weeks after their arrival, and by a delicious irony the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Flodden, Mary was carried in procession from her nursery at Stirling and crowned Queen of Scots in the adjacent Chapel Royal. It was an event of supreme significance. The coronation was the most solemn ritual known to church and state. Its symbolism was sacramental and conferred religious as well as civil legitimacy on her. In the course of the ceremony, a 9-month-old child was transformed into an anointed queen, possessed of those sacred powers of majesty that God alone could bestow or call to account. The crown, originally worn by James V at the coronation of Mary of Guise, was held over Mary's head by Cardinal Beaton, the Archbishop of St. Andrews, who was dressed in scarlet. He blessed her and anointed her with holy oil. She howled volubly and kept it up while every bishop and peer present knelt in turn to recite his oath of allegiance. Henry VIII died in January 1547, followed 2 months later by Francis I, King of France. These titans had dominated the affairs of the British Isles and Northern Europe for 30 years. Suddenly, there was a vacuum. Henry VIII's son and heir, Edward VI, was only 9. A regent or protector would be needed to govern until the king was 18, but Henry had shied away from giving so much power to any one person. Instead, he had used his will to appoint a council of regency to rule during his son's minority. Despite this, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, made himself Duke of Somerset and Protector of the realm within a week. He took vice-regal powers to govern England and its dominions. His overriding aim was to realise Henry VIII's dynastic plan by uniting the 2 crowns of England and Scotland through Mary's marriage to Edward. In France, the Dauphin Henry succeeded his father. He was crowned King Henry II. The Guises were among his chief advisers. The result was that the new French king at once declared himself to be the protector of Scotland. He decided to spare no expense to safeguard the old alliance and to ensure that Mary would marry no one except his own son, the Dauphin Francis. He flatly countered Somerset's idea of an Anglo-British union with his own master plan for a Franco-British empire. In August 1547, Somerset invaded Scotland with a massive army. He intended to conquer the country and settle permanent English garrisons from coast to coast. He meant to occupy and subdue Scotland and so force it into submission. His army was shadowed by an English fleet as it made its way north, ready to open fire if his troops were ambushed by the Scots. For once, the Scots were ready. When, on September the 10th, the English infantry surmounted a hill close to Inveresk, near Musselburgh, on the eastern approaches to Edinburgh, they were confronted by the largest Scottish army in history. Some 12,000 troops were skillfully positioned behind defensive trenches on the west bank of the Esk. They were put there to block the road into Edinburgh, and since on one side of them lay the sea and on the other an impenetrable marsh, Somerset would have to either launch a frontal attack or wheel his army around. As Somerset turned in search of a defensive position, the Scots attacked. The armies clashed on the hills above the hamlet of Pinkie. For an awesome moment, it looked as if the Scots pikemen could win. Then the English ordered a shock cavalry charge and fired their heavy guns to deadly effect. The Scots buckled. In the bombardment and ensuing carnage, 10,000 Scots were scythed down and killed. It was a second Flodden. The way lay open to Edinburgh and Stirling. Mary, aged 4, was hastily carried in a litter by night to Inchmahome Priory, a remote spot on an island in the Lake of Menteith, some 85 miles from the battle. Somerset did not occupy Edinburgh. Instead, he started to build a grid of quick, cheap forts from coast to coast in an attempt to hold the entire country at his will. If he expected this to work, he miscalculated. The backlash was so huge, it led to the one thing he had inexplicably overlooked, the removal of the young Queen of Scots to France. Mary landed not far from Roscoff in Brittany in mid-August 1548. She was to spend her next 13 years in France. They were to be some of the happiest days of her life, and she did not travel alone. She was accompanied by her maids of honour and 4 best friends, Mary Fleming,